I've carried this story around for years, and even now, typing it out makes my hands feel heavier than they should. Back then, I worked maintenance in an old office tower that sat on the edge of downtown. It was one of those buildings that had been renovated so many times that nobody really knew what belonged where anymore. New floors had been built over old ones. Hallways ended abruptly behind locked doors. Entire sections existed only on faded blueprints stored in dusty filing cabinets. And then there was the closed floor. Officially, it didn't exist. The elevator skipped its number entirely. The building directory jumped from the 23rd floor to the 25th. Security guards were instructed not to discuss it. Employees whispered about it during smoke breaks and then immediately changed the subject whenever management walked by. Naturally, everyone wanted to know what was up there, including me. At the time, I was drowning in debt. Gambling, bad investments, worse decisions. Every month felt like a race against bills I couldn't pay. I was desperate enough to notice things other people ignored. One night, while repairing a faulty electrical panel, I overheard two executives talking. They didn't know I was behind the service door. One of them mentioned records. The other mentioned valuables. Not cash exactly, but things worth more than cash. Documents. Evidence. Assets. The kind of things powerful people keep hidden. And they were discussing moving them to the closed floor. That conversation should have ended there. A normal person would have forgotten it. Instead, I became obsessed. For weeks, I started collecting scraps of information. I paid attention to security schedules. I listened to janitors' gossip. I watched which executives carried keycards that looked different from everyone else's. Every clue pointed toward the same place. The closed floor was real. And whatever was hidden there was important enough for people to pretend it didn't exist. The more I learned, the more a dangerous thought grew in my head. If something valuable was hidden up there, maybe it could solve all my problems. Maybe one visit was all I needed. Looking back now, I can pinpoint the exact moment the crime began. Not when I entered the floor. Not when I took something that wasn't mine. It started the second I convinced myself I deserved whatever was waiting behind those locked doors. That's the lie that makes everything else possible. And once I believed it, there was no turning back. The weeks after that conversation became an obsession. I told myself I was just curious, but that's not true. Curiosity was the excuse. Money was the reason. I started paying attention to details I would normally ignore. Every evening, after finishing my maintenance rounds, I'd linger near security stations, pretending to complete paperwork while listening to radio chatter. I learned which guards were strict and which spent half their shifts scrolling through their phones. The closed floor wasn't accessible through normal elevators. That discovery alone took nearly 2 weeks. Eventually, I noticed that certain executives used a service elevator hidden behind a locked corridor near the freight loading area. I never tried to force my way in. At least not yet. Instead, I watched. I built schedules in a notebook. Times. Names. Patterns. The more information I collected, the more confident I became. Confidence is dangerous because it disguises itself as intelligence. At home, surrounded by overdue bills, I convinced myself I was being practical. In reality, I was slowly crossing a line that I could still have walked away from. By the time I finally saw the closed floor with my own eyes, I already felt like I knew it. It happened late one Thursday, when a small power issue forced the service elevator into manual mode. I was called in under the excuse of routine inspection, though nothing about it felt routine. While I stood near the access area, I noticed something I hadn't before. The elevator panel didn't just skip the number. It behaved like the floor itself resisted being acknowledged. People avoided looking at it directly. Even the guards spoke quieter near that corridor, as if sound itself was unwelcome there. I remember asking a senior technician about it once. He laughed, but not comfortably. He said, "Some places in a building are just storage. Don't overthink it." That answer should have satisfied me. It didn't. Instead, it confirmed what I already believed, that something was being deliberately hidden. And whatever it was, it mattered enough to keep locked away from everyone else, including me. That was the moment I stopped thinking of it as curiosity and started thinking of it as access. After that first real glimpse of the restricted corridor, I started structuring my entire work schedule around it. Not in an obvious way. I still showed up, still fixed what I was assigned, still nodded at supervisors like nothing had changed. But inside my head, everything was reorganized around the closed floor. I began tracking people instead of tasks. Who arrived early? Who left late? Who never spoke to each other? Especially the executives connected to the service elevator. There was a rhythm to them. Predictable, almost comforting. Like they believed routine made them untouchable. I also started noticing something else. The building itself changed tone near that section. Cameras were newer there. Doors had extra layers of locks. Even the lighting felt intentional, harsher, more clinical. And yet, despite all of that, there were gaps. Small inconsistencies. A door left open for seconds too long. A guard distracted at the wrong moment. A maintenance request that didn't match any logged issue. I told myself I was just observing. But the truth is, I was building a map in my mind. And maps are made for one reason: navigation. I didn't wake up one day and decide to break into the closed floor. It crept in slowly, like a thought I stopped arguing with. At first, it was just, what if? Then it became, how would someone even? And eventually it became something I rehearsed in my head during breaks, like a mental puzzle I couldn't put down. I started imagining the layout beyond the elevator doors. Blank spaces filled in with guesses based on ventilation routes, service diagrams, and where the building felt hollow. It sounds ridiculous now, but at the time, it felt like logic. I even convinced myself I had a justification. I told myself I wasn't stealing. I was uncovering something that was already wrong. Something hidden. Something unfair. That kind of reasoning is slippery. It doesn't feel like a decision. It feels like discovery. There was a night I stayed late, long after my shift ended, just sitting in the maintenance office staring at the floor plans. I remember thinking, if I don't do it, someone else will. And somehow, that made it feel inevitable instead of reckless. The strangest part is how normal everything still looked on the outside. I still joked with coworkers. Still complained about broken elevators and bad coffee. Still acted like my life was just another routine in a tired building. But inside my head, I was somewhere else entirely. The idea of the closed floor stopped being a question and started becoming a destination. Something I would eventually reach, one way or another. I began rehearsing scenarios, not detailed plans, just fragments. What I would say if someone stopped me. How I would react if I was questioned. How I would explain being somewhere I shouldn't be. It wasn't about confidence. It was about reducing fear by pretending I had control. I also noticed something unsettling. The more I thought about it, the less wrong it felt. Not right, just less wrong, like my sense of boundaries was slowly dulling around the edges. One night I caught my reflection in a dark window in the building. I barely recognized the expression. It wasn't excitement anymore. It was certainty. Finding the actual access point changed everything. It stopped being theory and became something physical I could touch. It was tucked behind a service corridor near the freight section, exactly where most people wouldn't linger unless they had a reason. A plain door, no signage, just a card reader that looked newer than anything else around it. I told myself I only noticed it because I was observant. That's what I kept calling it, observant. Not fixated. Not obsessed. But I started timing how long guards stayed near that corridor. I learned the rotation down to minutes. I even figured out when deliveries created small distractions that pulled attention away from that side of the building. Each discovery made the next step feel smaller. What surprised me most wasn't how hard it was to study the system, but how many tiny cracks existed inside it. Nothing was as airtight as it was supposed to be. Still, I didn't move. Not yet. I stood outside that corridor more times than I can count, pretending I was just passing through. Every time, I left without doing anything. And every time, it felt like I was postponing something inevitable. The night I finally acted didn't feel dramatic. There was no storm outside. No sudden burst of courage. No moment where I told myself, "This is it." It was just another late shift. That ordinary feeling is what still bothers me. Life-changing mistakes rarely announce themselves. They arrive disguised as routine. The building was quieter than usual. A few offices still had lights on, but most of the tower had emptied out. I remember walking through hallways I'd crossed hundreds of times and feeling strangely detached, like I was watching myself from a distance. My heart was racing, though. Not because I thought I was brave. Because part of me knew I could still turn around. For several minutes, I stood alone near the restricted corridor, arguing with myself. One side listed every reason to leave. The other repeated the same thing I'd been telling myself for months: "You've come this far already." That thought won. Looking back, that was the real point of no return. Not a door opening or a rule being broken. Just a decision made in silence. The moment I stepped beyond the restricted area, reality felt different from everything I had imagined. For months, the closed floor had existed in my mind as a mystery, almost a legend. I expected something dramatic waiting on the other side, proof that all my suspicions had been justified. Instead, the first thing I noticed was how ordinary it seemed. Quiet hallways. Locked offices. Rows of storage rooms. That ordinary appearance actually made me more nervous. If everything looked normal, then what exactly had I risked so much to find? I moved carefully, trying to stay calm, but my body refused to cooperate. My pulse was pounding so hard that every distant sound felt amplified. Then I found records. Boxes, cabinets, and archived materials that clearly weren't meant for public access. I won't describe exactly what I did next, but I crossed a line I had spent months approaching. The second it happened, the excitement disappeared. Not later. Immediately. Because once a crime stops being an idea and becomes a reality, you're forced to face a question that planning never answers. What happens now? The biggest surprise wasn't what I found. It was the fact that I wasn't alone. I had spent months focusing on doors, schedules, and procedures. In my mind, the closed floor was a place, an empty location holding secrets. I hadn't thought enough about the people connected to it. As I was trying to leave, I heard voices somewhere down the corridor. Calm voices. Unhurried. The kind of conversation that instantly tells you the speakers belong there. Every muscle in my body locked up. I remember freezing in place, listening to footsteps grow louder. For a few terrifying seconds, I was certain everything was over. I imagined security being called, supervisors questioning me, my entire life unraveling before sunrise. The footsteps stopped. Then the voices moved away. I should have taken that as a warning and left immediately. Instead, panic pushed me in the opposite direction. I became focused on protecting myself from consequences. That shift in thinking changed everything. Up until then, my goal had been getting in. Now my goal was making sure nobody ever knew I had been there. And fear makes people make terrible decisions. I made it out of the closed floor that night. At least physically. Mentally, a part of me never really left. The next morning, I expected alarms, investigations, or at the very least a tense atmosphere in the building. Instead, everything looked normal. People chatted in elevators. Phones rang. Meetings started on schedule. The world hadn't changed. But I had. Every casual conversation suddenly felt dangerous. Whenever a supervisor called my name, my stomach tightened. Whenever security walked past, I wondered if they knew something I didn't. That constant tension became exhausting. I started reading meaning into everything. A glance lasted too long. A question sounded suspicious. A routine email felt directed at me personally. Nobody was accusing me of anything. The accusations were coming from my own conscience. What surprised me most was how little satisfaction remained. For months I'd imagined reaching my goal would solve problems, bring relief, maybe even make the risk worthwhile. Instead, I felt trapped. The secret demanded constant attention. And the more I protected it, the heavier it became. A few weeks passed before the first real signs of trouble appeared. Nothing dramatic happened at first. No one stormed into the maintenance office. No investigators arrived asking questions. It started with rumors. People began talking about an internal review. Nobody seemed to know exactly what was being reviewed, which somehow made the rumors worse. Every version of the story was different. Missing records, audit issues, executive concerns, security procedures. I listened quietly and pretended not to care. Inside, I was unraveling. The hardest part was not knowing whether the review had anything to do with me. My mind automatically assumed it did. Every new piece of gossip felt like another thread tightening around my neck. Sleep became difficult. I would wake up in the middle of the night replaying every decision I'd made, searching for mistakes. The more I thought about it, the more mistakes I found. That's the thing about hindsight, it never runs out of evidence. By then, I had become two different people. The employee everyone knew, and the version of me carrying a secret that seemed to grow larger every day. The moment that frightened me most wasn't an alarm or an investigation. It was a conversation. One afternoon, my supervisor asked if I had a minute to talk. The request was completely ordinary. He'd said the same thing dozens of times before. But the second I heard it, my pulse spiked. I followed him to his office convinced that everything had finally caught up with me. On the walk there, my mind raced through every possibility. Had security footage been reviewed? Had someone noticed inconsistencies? Had a coworker reported seeing me somewhere I shouldn't have been? By the time we sat down, I could barely focus. Then he started discussing an unrelated maintenance issue. That was it. A routine problem with equipment scheduling. I answered his questions, nodded at the appropriate moments, and somehow made it through the meeting. Afterward, I went to the restroom and stared at myself in the mirror. The fear felt real enough to touch. That's when I realized something important. Even if nobody else knew what I'd done, the crime was still controlling my life. The punishment had already begun, and I was delivering it to myself. Several months later, the uncertainty finally ended. Not because I confessed. Because the building changed. One morning, entire sections of the restricted area were suddenly under tighter control. New security measures appeared almost overnight. Access procedures were revised. Meetings were held behind closed doors. Whatever review had been happening in the background had reached a conclusion. Nobody explained much to employees. But word spread. Something had been discovered. Even now, I don't know exactly how much they uncovered or what conclusions they reached. People shared theories, and every theory sounded worse than the last. What I do know is that nobody ever approached me directly. No accusations. No interrogation. No arrest. For a while, that felt like relief. Then I realized it wasn't. Because I wasn't celebrating freedom. I was measuring distance. Counting days. Waiting for consequences that might still arrive. The fear had become a habit. And habits don't disappear when danger passes. By then, I had stopped worrying about getting caught. What worried me was the person I had become while trying not to be. So that's the story of the closed floor. People sometimes assume that the worst part of committing a crime is getting caught. Maybe that's true for some people. For me, the worst part was discovering how easily I justified crossing lines I once thought were permanent. I was never the movie version of a criminal. I wasn't fearless. I wasn't clever. I wasn't even particularly desperate compared to many people facing harder lives. What I was, more than anything, was willing to keep making small compromises until they became one enormous mistake. That's the lesson that stayed with me. The decision that changes your life rarely feels life-changing at the time. It feels reasonable, temporary, necessary. Years later, I still think about that version of myself walking through those hallways, convinced he was solving his problems. He wasn't. He was creating new ones. If anyone reading this finds themselves rationalizing something they know is wrong, stop and question the story you're telling yourself. Most bad decisions begin as perfectly convincing explanations. Mine certainly did. And that's why I still remember the closed floor,